Thank you very much, Condi, for those thoughts. And I thought your opening remark was particularly telling, your point that these are not a discrete series of crises, but they are revealing, as you said, a breakdown in international order. And you went through your three key dimensions, dynamics of that: a challenge to free markets, ultimately maybe a loss of confidence in some of the institutions you described, IMF, the World Trade Organization. And you talked later on about how TTIP or the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership and others might help re-engage some of that. Free peoples, and the lessons that have been learned. And then you pointed out to some of the challenges to free peoples, both in ungoverned states, but also in Russia and China. And then, most tellingly, and if I may just throw a first question in before drawing in our members and guests here, the US commitment to defend, the promise not to leave, as you phrased it, the lesson learned painfully twice over in the beginning of the 20th century when the US came twice, once obviously in much greater numbers than the first time. And if I could just come to that quickly, that point on that third one, about where the US is right now, in your opinion. You've got a bit of detachment now from your time in government. I know you obviously follow US politics closely, but where do you think the mood of the country is? Certainly here, there is a sense that America is disengaging itself to a certain extent, or is certainly being selective about where it engages, and how it engages is in a more, some people use the term, offshore-ish kind of way, rather than institutionally committed way. Could you just say a word or two about where America sits as obviously one corner of this transatlantic relationship?
Well, certainly. I think there's no doubt that Americans feel that we have carried the burden of leadership for a very, very long time. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, weren't we done? And then there's Al-Qaeda, and weren't we done? And we've tried, and there's Afghanistan, and there's Iraq. Aren't we done? There's no doubt that that is there, and a sense that we have a big agenda at home. That is all true. But it is also true that people can hold in their heads contradictory thoughts at the same time. And on the one hand, you can hold a thought that you'd really like to leave those people to their own devices, especially in the Middle East, where Americans see just chaos. But at the same time, be quite unhappy with the results of leaving people to their own devices. And so when you see in the 21st century people being beheaded on social media or burned alive on social media, or hear of 8-year-old girls being raped in the middle of the Middle East, people say, no, I didn't buy on for that either. And I believe that what Americans are looking for is leadership to help them resolve those contradictions in a way that says we can't do everything. Nobody wants another large land war in the Middle East. I don't want another large land war in the Middle East. But there's so many elements short of a large land war in the Middle East. And I do think that Americans do recognize that when reminded of the lessons, for instance, of 9/11, that if you don't go to try to help resolve the troubles will come to you. And you can't live on an island these days. If ISIS, by the latest numbers that I've seen, maybe it's 40,000 or so core, it will one day be 100,000 if it isn't defeated. And oh, by the way, a lot of European passport holders, a few American passport holders, you really think they're not going to come home? You really think that isn't a homeland problem? And so just sketching out for Americans that we don't have the luxury of simply sitting. Somebody has to believe in shaping the international system, or the system will shape you in terms of what's possible, your security, your prosperity. Yeah. And I think that's the argument to the American people, and I frankly think after a while of hearing, well, we can withdraw, and then seeing the results, I think they might be up for it.
And I was just, as I do once a year, having a little read of Vladimir Putin's Valdai remarks. It's always an interesting thing. I'm sure you do this as well. And certainly when I was reading it last year, I thought, did he realize that George W. Bush had left the White House and now Obama had been in for 5 years? Because it was like if America was still out there doing everything. But one of his arguments is America actually created the disorder. Yeah. That the mismanagement of the Iraq crisis unleashed this disorder somehow. And now, having unleashed it, you guys are stepping back. And so, you know, we've got to step in. And people nod here, and people nod in the UK, and so on. What do you think about that line?
Well, let's take Iraq first. I fully understand that we pulled some of the pins out of what had been stability by tyranny under Saddam Hussein. But what had stability under tyranny bought us? It had bought us a couple of wars against allies. It had bought us 1 million people dead. It bought us mass graves. And it had bought us a weapons of mass destruction threat, which, though not as immediate as we had thought, the intelligence was clearly wrong. I don't know about a Saddam Hussein faced with an Iranian nuclear weapon and how he might have reacted to that. So I think the problem is, yes, we pulled some of the pins out of this system that was getting weaker because the state system was under pressure, and the Arab Spring would then kind of complete that. But no, we had nothing to do with Libya. The United States did, but those of us who were involved in Iraq did not. You know, the North Africa and the problems in North Africa, you can go on. And the Syrian conflict, I think, is really the one that spilled over and gave ISIS oxygen. Because while there might have been some disaffected people from Saddam's forces and the like, the ability to occupy that swath of territory was not because of the Iraq situation. It would have been, I think, better had we stayed, had we left some forces there. We might have seen ISIS coming. But whatever you want to say about all of that, the collapse in Syria really is what created that. Now, to Vladimir Putin's, I just want to create order, and shouldn't you thank me for it. We make a very big mistake if we think that his concept of order and our concept of order are the same. There is no doubt that he worries a lot about extremism and terrorism. The first conversation that we had with him in July of 2001 in Slovenia, long before 9/11, was about extremism. However, his idea of stability is let's just control that part of the territory that we can control. We'll leave eastern Ukraine as a failed state because at least Kiev can't control it, and my people may be making a mess of it, but at least Kiev can't govern it. Let's leave Moldova and let's leave Georgia as frozen conflicts, and I'll work with the Abkhaz and the Ossetians, but then Tbilisi can't really control all of its territory. And watch out in Syria that you don't get a peace proposal that is essentially based on the same idea. So Assad and his people will control the third that they can. The rest of it will be terrorists and unspeakables, and we'll just kind of keep them at bay. And then we'll go to the peace table, and we'll negotiate a future for Syria based on Assad or somebody like him, because Vladimir Putin is not sentimental about Assad. If he's ever a liability, it'll be somebody else. But that will defend Russia's interest. That will defend Iran's interest. And how good to have in the Iranians an ally that has a disruptive vision for the Middle East that can keep everybody off base. So the idea of Vladimir Putin as the savior of stability, let's just say I don't buy it.
You're not buying it, clearly. Yeah. Right. Let me bring other people in because we've got a good 25 minutes. Sea of hands going up. I'll do them as I've seen them and try to be equal around the room as well. First, right at the back under the camera. I think I recognize it. It's Jonathan Isle. Right. Yeah, and be a little patient with microphones getting to you because we're, for various reasons, quite full.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute. You said isolate Putinism, but don't isolate the Russians. It's a profound phrase, and I'm sure that the journalists would like it for tomorrow morning newspapers. But how is one to execute it? How does one calibrate it? For instance, would you support permanent stationing of troops in the new member states of the alliance as one of these moves? I mean, we're grappling with this for 20 years, trying to isolate individuals from a nation, which we must embrace, as you said.
Yes. Well, Putinism, I think, is broader, by the way, than Vladimir Putin. One of the problems is sometimes when we look at authoritarians, we assume that they rule only by fear. Vladimir Putin actually has a constituency. It is older, it is rural, it is military retirees, it's largely uneducated people, and they only watch television, most of which is about the great man. And so it's not as if, I don't believe the 89%, but I believe he's broadly popular within his country. But he's not broadly popular with that part of the Russian population that bought onto the notion that they might finally integrate into the West. And so it's finding ways to reach those people. For instance, continue to hire Russians in companies abroad. Continue to hire Russians in law firms and in banks. Continue to bring Russian students to the United States and to Europe and to Great Britain for training and for education. I talked to liberal Russian economists. They say if the price of oil stays this way, they will have to listen to us eventually, because after all, 80% of Russian exports are in oil, gas, and minerals. 65% of the budget is oil, gas, and minerals. Somewhere along the way, the economic realities are going to catch up. And so much as we sometimes have to do in places where the opposition can't raise its head, you just try to keep the opposition alive. And I think we all have an obligation to do that. Given my own preferences, I would have, for instance, in response to the Ukraine crisis, done more on the military side, like deploy into Eastern Europe and less on the sanction side. Because some of the sanctions are a pretty blunt tool. And you sometimes capture people that you actually didn't want to capture. Because the Russian integration into the economy is a good thing, not a bad thing. And so while it's fine to have sanctions on Putin's inner circle and the like, even though if you really think that they have any assets outside the country that are reachable, I've got something to sell you. But I think you have to try to keep those contacts to the different Russia, that if the economic circumstances finally emerge, they may have a say. They may finally have a say.
So you would have balanced more strongly the military, let's say, the reassurance side, and maybe being a little more cautious on the sanctions.
Yes, and
that's an interesting different angle.
And more on the help Ukraine side.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Help Ukraine, reassure the neighbors, and use the sanctions very minimally, because you end up with unintended consequences for people you're trying to support.
Good. I've got a couple of questions here at the front, and then we're moving around. So, yeah.
Thank you. My name's Claire Jarvis. I'm from the British Institute for International Comparative Law. China and Saudi Arabia are in the news in Britain at the moment because of their troubling human rights practices and our ever closer economic ties to them. And I don't think it's any coincidence that at the same time the British government has dropped human rights from its foreign policy agenda. And this, to me, exemplifies an attitude that regards human rights and trade and human rights and national security as necessarily in conflict with each other. So I wanted to ask, how do we convince our leaders on both sides of the Atlantic that not only can we have both, we must have both in promoting international stability?
We must have both, because ultimately authoritarian regimes are brittle. You need to get even, particularly with allies like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, to get them to reform before their people are in the streets. That was always my argument to Mubarak. Reform before your people are in the streets. And a decent record on human rights is just the first step in making sure that governments are somehow able to deal with their people. A country that is so brutal on human rights is by its nature dangerous in the system. I also always found, whether it was with the Saudis or with the Chinese, you can raise human rights issues and you can even do it publicly in a respectful way. You don't actually have to pull your punches on those issues. And with China in particular, they knew that we were going to raise those issues. They always had their response prepared. But nobody was surprised when the American Secretary of State brought a list of human rights concerns to the foreign minister, or said in the after press conference that it was our hope that China would move to greater respect for human rights and religious freedom, which were always the twin pillars. I think we have to have a soul about this. And the one thing, we all sit around and we criticize democracy and we say how hard it is, and we sometimes say, you know, those people aren't quite ready for it. What's amazing to me is that the people who don't have it, the number of people who will risk jail and people who will risk harm and who will even risk their lives just to be treated decently. And the least we can do is speak out for them.
Right. There's a question directly behind it here. As I see the hands, I'll get to you all. Yep.
Hi, Christine Michaelagic. I work in foreign exchange trading out in Canary Wharf. Looking at just recently, Canada elected a prime minister who wants to pull out of fighting ISIS. In the US, we have Bernie Sanders, we've got Corbyn in the UK. A big underpinning of the Transatlantic Alliance is the willingness of the people in those countries to take on this very difficult role and responsibility. What do we do? How do we maintain faith in, or a sense of duty in countries where that's, as they look at the chaos, it seems like it's beginning to fail?
Yes. Well, first let me say that I think we accept I personally accept some responsibility for, in the United States, a sense of being tired, right? Because I told President Bush at one point, he was complaining about the polls, and this was in August of 2008, and I said, you know what, they're tired of us, all right? It's been war, it's been revolution, it's been vigilance, it's been terrorism. They're really tired of us. But the fact is, you have to say to people, but great powers that want to shape the environment can't get tired, because it's not as if when we step back and don't want to shape the environment will just be benign. Others will shape it, and they will shape it in a way that is antithetical to both our interests and to our values, and that's not a good place to be. So we're going to have to find, and by the way, the isolationist argument hasn't actually done very well in the United States in this recent campaign. A lot of people thought that, for instance, Senator Paul would go out with a strong isolationist message. He found himself weaving back to, well, there are some things that we will have to take on. Because after all of these years of benefiting from a system that had to be defended, I don't quite think that Americans, and I hope Europeans and the British, are not ready to yield and say, well, that's fine. We created that system. We profited from it. We did very well in terms of trade. We did well in terms of economic benefit, and it's been. We'll just leave it to somebody else now, because we're seeing who you end up leaving it to, and people don't much like that either.
Right, in the back. A question in the middle there, in the back. Yeah, put your hand up. Yeah, there you go. And then I'm going over this side because I've been going a lot this way. I do have a number of hands. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon Fraser. I'm the former permanent secretary in the Foreign Office. We're 3/4 of an hour into this fascinating discussion, but we haven't yet touched on the point that this country, within the next year or so, is going to have a referendum on the future of its relationship in Europe. And I recognize what a sensitive issue that is for public comment, but nevertheless it's a very important issue. And I wondered if you would care to say something about how that choice could affect the transatlantic relationship.
Yes. Well, the British people will have to decide. It's a democracy, and I know that it's going to be a very stimulating debate.
Could be the diplomat.
Right, democracy. Democracy is absolutely necessary, but sometimes it's rather cacophonous, and I think that's going to be the case. I, as an American, hope that Europe will continue to have a transatlantic link, which is Britain. It is a very different Europe if it is a continental Europe. I was a part of the American administration under George H.W. Bush that helped to unify Germany. I am a Germanophile. I actually have great respect for Angela Merkel and what she's doing. But a Europe without Britain will be a very different Europe in terms of international politics. Not because Germany is not a great ally of the United States, it is, but because the perspective of a Britain which has always had a global view of how human history ought to unfold and has, through the special relationship with the United States, pursued that view, that would be missing from Europe. And a Britain that has always looked both towards the continent and across the pond that would be missing from Europe. And so from my point of view, my narrow parochial American point of view, there are a lot of Americans who will make fun of the European experiment. And you say to them, look, it's not perfect, and of course, the European Union, you will negotiate different terms, I'm certain of that. But let's not forget that the European Union was really born out of the horrors of World War II, a hope to make Germany a democratic part of a Europe, and Helmut Kohl was always one when you would say a unified Germany, he would say within a unified Europe. And it's a Europe that succeeded in creating prosperity on the continent, and while the Soviet Union was still a stride part of Europe. And I think the little really acknowledged role that Europe and NATO played as lodestars for the Eastern Central Europeans as they were escaping the Soviet tyranny. It allowed Hungary and Romania not to give way to violence over Transylvania. It allowed Bulgaria and Turkey to work out differences. It allowed civil military reform. This was a tremendous, tremendous success, the second phase of European integration. And as I said, it has to be tended to now because I think some fissures are made. But Europe has been a tremendous, it's been tremendously successful. But I think the European-American link, the transatlantic link, has been tremendously successful, largely because Britain has been the bridge.
Thank you. Let me take some pairs of questions, otherwise I'm running out of time. And I've got some questions there. Gentlemen, been waiting patiently there in the question in the corner, and then there. Yeah.
Dominic Dudley, I'm a freelance journalist and a member of Chatham House. My question's about Iran and the sanctions deal. What's your take on the deal? Are you supportive of it? And what do you think of the realistic prospects for US-Iranian relations going forward? And how is that going to affect the relations with other Gulf allies like the Saudis?
Just hold that thought, and then there with you've got a popping on. Keep your hand up, please. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Nick Greenstock from Gatehouse, and Chatham House member. This goes back to kind of Danny Roderick's kind of theory about the parodies, indeed the paradox of globalization and sovereign states. You've obviously the concept of exporting the pure metrics of democracy into supranational systems then hollows out the sovereign states themselves, and you've felt that play through in terms of the democratic deficits. How does that work for the US and its attempts to kind of reach out?
Yes. Let me take the point about the sovereign state first. I think the sovereign state is going to be around for a while. But it has to be, and this was the genius really of what the people of 45 and 46 I think saw. It has to have permeable boundaries in a number of ways. In terms of trade, it has to have permeable boundaries, frankly, in terms of the flow of people. I know that this is a very difficult issue right now, but the United States has benefited greatly from an immigration policy that was largely open, that didn't define we the people as an exclusive concept. And so I think that the Westphalian state, at least not so much in the Middle East where it's breaking apart, but the export of democracy, I think actually I've always believed is best when done within the nation-state character. Now that doesn't mean that you can't have transnational concerns about human rights. And the civil society implications of a national endowment for democracy or what the European Union does through democracy promotion, I still think we do it within the building sovereign states, because sovereign states that can deliver for their people, protect their borders, and have the respect for their people to insist that their people have a say in who's going to govern them, that's the best stability you can possibly buy. And so I don't see it as breaking down these borders, but rather actually strengthening them from within. When it comes to the Iran deal, well, I did not take a public position on this deal because I know how hard it is to be in there as opposed to out here. I can remember so many times, picking up the Washington Post and the editorial says the Bush administration should unite the world around tough sanctions on Iran, and I would think, Why didn't I think of that? That's so brilliant. Well, because it's hard, all right? It's hard. And I know how hard it was to get this deal. I was one of the founders of the P5+1, along with Jack Straw. As a matter of fact, we did it at Jack Straw's house in November of 2006. So I'm a big supporter of having a two-track approach with the Iranians. This particular deal, I think, has some good elements, but the price that was paid was pretty high. I don't know how we will know where Iran will break out when we don't have a very good accounting for where they have been. It's entirely possible that they are already at threshold status and we will never know it. I fear that we're going to get into a lot of back and forth and disagreement about violations of the Iranians, because the Iranians are not going to be stupid enough to cheat at declared sites. And it's never going to be black and white. And one of the reasons that we had the Iraq problem was we had uncertainty about what Saddam Hussein was actually doing. And we had too many fights with the Russians and others about that. And I fear we're getting back into that. More importantly, $100 billion for the Iranians to destabilize the Middle East. And, by the way, a collapse or a lapse of the conventional weapons ban that I fear is going to create an arms race in the Middle East, with the Iranians buying weaponry that won't threaten the Israelis and the Saudis. It will threaten American denial capability. So it's not a deal that I care much for, but it's there. And I would never say pull out of it, but I would hope that we, with our European allies, could put in place something that says to the Iranians, your behavior is simply unacceptable. You are tearing apart the Middle East, and that won't stand. And we will, if necessary, impose sanctions again based on your behavior.
Just one little, then I know we're short on time, but I heard an Israeli say the other day, Iran is the one country that maybe does have institutions of governance in the Middle East, unlike most other countries across the Arab world.
Yes.
Might it actually be, you talked about $100 billion to destabilize as opposed to $100 billion to build on those institutions.
Oh, they have institutions, all right. The only problem is they're all dominated by one man. And the ability of, now Khamenei reportedly is ill. Maybe he will go away. Maybe those institutions will come into being. But I don't see anything right now that suggests that those institutions that we would recognize as sort of institutions of governance are trumping those institutions that are destabilizing the Middle East, like the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard and Hassan Soleimani, who seems to be on quite a tear.
Pop-ups everywhere. All right. Question, we've been waiting very patiently there and here.
Ned Simons from the Huffington Post. Dr. Rice, you spoke about 9/11 and also the campaign. Donald Trump suggested that President Bush was to blame in part for 9/11. I wonder what your response to that was.
Interesting. Have a think on that for a second.
Yes.
One more question. Just give you
Thank you for not letting me answer right away.
Hello, Terence Parker, member of Chatham House and RUSI. Looking at freedom and human rights and sanctions,
hold the microphone a bit close to your mouth.
Looking outside at America, one gets a feeling that the human rights and freedom of the Palestinians don't get enough sanctions from America to bring about progress in their direction.
I spent more time on the Palestinian-Israeli issue than I think almost any American Secretary of State. I was in the region 25 times to try to bring peace between them. Ehud Olmert put a proposal on the table. And I said to President Abbas, take it. Because every time you turn down a proposal in 48, in 67, in 2000, now your state gets smaller. We worked desperately to try and create Palestinian security forces who could secure Palestinians from the horrors of people like Hamas. We worked desperately to try and create economic opportunity through a great Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad. I personally went to the Congress and asked if we could finally free budget authority for the Palestinian authorities with American foreign aid, and we got that through. The United States has worked tirelessly to try to bring a two-state solution. And from time to time, I think we're close. But the fact of the matter is, as long as Hamas controls Gaza, and as long as there are rockets from Gaza into Israel, you're going to have an Israeli response to that. You would have it from any democratic government. And so the answer still remains the one that we've always talked about, which is the Palestinians need to govern themselves. But Fatah needs to reform. It needs a generational shift. It needs to empower decent governance for its own people. And then it needs to sit down with the Israelis and finally resolve some of the problems that we all know the answers to. We know that it's going to be a certain percentage of the territory with swaps for the rest of it. We know it's going to be a small number of refugees who are going to be given the right to go back with compensation for the others. We know that it's going to be Palestinian security forces that are police forces, not an army. We know that something is going to have to be said about Jerusalem and governing the holy sites. We know the answer. This is one of those frustrating international issues where we actually know the answer and we can't quite get to it. And so I think the United States, and that's every administration, including the current administration, has done everything possible to try to bring a solution to that crisis. And just because we aren't willing to go and sanction our ally Israel, when the Palestinians have been unable to take a deal too, I think the Americans are not guilty on that one. And I think President Bush is not guilty on 9/11. I would ask, all Mr. Trump has to do is read the 9/11 report. It's incredibly exhaustive about what caused the problem. It's incredibly exhaustive about the challenges of intelligence when we had a very firm barrier between intelligence coming from the outside and intelligence that we could gather inside, the FBI in charge of one, the CIA in the other. It's incredibly clear about the need for reform of intelligence agencies, reform of how the Congress does this. And yes, maybe there was a lack of imagination to imagine that a group of terrorists were going to hijack airplanes and not drive them to the ground and demand a ransom, but use them as missiles against our cities. I plead guilty to a lack of imagining exactly that. But I want to say one other thing. The idea that somehow the President of the United States was warned that Al-Qaeda was going to attack the United States and did nothing about it, really? Do you think any president of the United States, if he'd had even an inkling that there was going to be that attack that day, wouldn't have moved heaven and earth to try to stop it? The fact is, there was chatter in July and August about terrorist activity. It was just that chatter. And most of the chatter, we thought, and the CIA thought, was about a possible attack in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia or abroad. The United States had no systems in place for homeland defense. We hadn't been attacked on our territory since the War of 1812. And so the President of the United States would have done anything to stop it. He didn't know enough, didn't have good enough intelligence to stop it. But I think the real issue here is not revisiting the past. But I would ask any presidential candidate, how are you going to prevent it from happening again? What are you going to do about those passport holders from ISIS who are going to come home? What are you going to do about the tensions of homegrown terrorism? What are you going to do about, do you believe that big data has to be used by the intelligence agencies to track terrorists or not? I will tell you one final story about this. Sometime around September 8th or 9th, one of the hijackers, would-be hijackers, made a telephone call from San Diego to Afghanistan. We didn't track in the way that we do now. And Hamzi al-Mitar, it's not that we might have found him, but I'll tell you, if anybody had known that Hamzi al-Mitar was in the country, because he was on everybody's watch list, it would have triggered. And so before people start revisiting the past who want to be president, they ought to address how they're going to do it in the future. Because the one thing that I will proudly say is after the horrors of 9/11, it didn't happen again on President Bush's watch.
Now, we've gone over time. There's one issue I feel has not been addressed. A lot of people still have their hands up, but I'm afraid I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair. And as this is the John Whitehead lecture on transatlantic relations, but also on UK-US relations. Can I just finish with one last question, which hopefully one of the other people who had their hand up was going to ask. There was the comment about UK foreign policy affected by its position in Europe. But there's a broader sense, reported in the US, commented on here, that the UK and the US are actually on different strategic trajectories. And that the most emblematic example of this is how we're handling the rise of China. We had President Xi's visit here last week. It's interesting how cybersecurity was at the top of the list of the visit to the US, but really didn't feature publicly, at least, on the visit here. The UK is committing, I think it believes this government strategically to China's rise, and the UK benefiting from it. The US has entirely different obligations in terms of security commitments in East Asia and deployments, etc., as you well know. Could China become a wedge in this US-UK relationship and potentially US-European relationship? So we're not that different in the UK from the rest of Europe. You wrote even back in 2000, I did look back at your foreign affairs article and ahead of this, really could have been written for now with where Russia and China would be in this mix. How do you see this affecting the UK-US relationship?
Well, I don't think that China needs to become a wedge between us if we actually think, what is it that we're trying to do with China? And I think our strategic interests are actually quite similar here. China is going to be more influential in international politics because it is a rising power. Now, we can overstate that because it's got a lot of work to do at home. This shift from a heavy export-driven, low cost of labor, heavy government investment economy to one that is more free market, that has to start to get rid of SOEs, that has to start to free up. You're not going to be able to have both the free market and control it from Beijing. So they've got a lot on their plate, not to mention a terrible demographic situation. So we can overestimate their quick rise. But let's say they are rising, they are.
Yep.
Our desire should be that they rise in a way that is supportive of and fits more easily, at least into the system that we help to build, both on the international economic side and slowly but surely the liberalization of Chinese politics. We don't need a revolution in China, but they need to liberalize their politics if they're going to take full advantage of their people in this more market-based economy. So we should be coaxing them to them. So let me take one example of where I think we could have been on the same page and the United States made the mistake. When the Chinese came and said they wanted to do an Asian infrastructure development bank, we should have said, oh, wow, that's a great idea. Asia needs infrastructure. And we should have been the first to join. Rather than getting into a fight with our closest allies, so that then our closest ally, Britain, goes ahead and joins, and we look like the odd man out. There are ways that we can help coax the Chinese. And the Chinese want their companies to be global companies. I live not very far from the international headquarters for Huawei. Huawei is going to have trouble as long as the Chinese are doing things in cybersecurity that make people nervous about Chinese telecommunications equipment. So you say to them, this doesn't work. On the other hand, Alibaba, Tencent, WeChat, these are going to be great companies. Why shouldn't we be encouraging that part of China's rise? And when we pivot to Asia on a more security foot, we play on their territory rather than ours. And so I think we should have more cooperation and coordination on how to manage China's rise. It really doesn't have to be a source of tension between us. And hopefully we can be successful in helping China to rise in a way that doesn't create more problems than it solves.
Thank you very much for taking that
Thank
question.
you.
And my apologies to everyone for keeping you waiting. A big thank you to Condoleezza Rice. This is really, I think, did justice to what John Whitehead would have liked to have heard. Also great for us to hear both that mix of experience and future looking. Thank you very much to Dr. Condoleezza Rice.